Hello, everybody. Welcome to a special event. We are very excited today to welcome a friend to many of us and a longtime collaborator here with CSAC, Joe Cirincione. For those of you who haven't been to one of these before that I've emceed, I'm Colin Call, by the way. I'm the Social Science Co-Director here at the Center for International Security and Cooperation. And it's my great pleasure to welcome Joe, who has served as the president of Plowshares Fund, a global security foundation since 2008.
Yes.
My research is correct.
It's correct.
The organization has been an essential supporter of nuclear research and has advocated for a saner nuclear policy for a long, long time and has done extraordinarily impactful work. And I've known Joe, I think, for almost a decade now at this point, but we worked most closely together when I was in the Obama administration, and Joe and Plowshares were instrumental in organizing arms control groups, civil society groups, and others to provide sensible commentary and advice on the Iran nuclear deal as we were trying to finalize that agreement and then defend it in the halls of Congress. And it was a joy to work closely with Joe in the few years before I went into the Obama administration, working on that issue, and then during the Obama administration on that issue. Joe has worked on nuclear weapons policy in Washington for more than 3 decades. He is the author of a number of important books, including Nuclear Nightmares, Securing the World Before It's Too Late.
Romance novel.
Yep, Bomb Scare, The History and Future of Nuclear Weapons, and Deadly Arsenals, Nuclear Biology and Chemical Threats.
It's so cheery.
They're all comedies in that haha, we're all gonna die kind of way. Before his time at Plowshares, Joe was Vice President for National Security at the Center for American Progress, Director for Nonproliferation at the Carnegie Endowment, and a Senior Associate at Stimson. And he also worked for 9 years on the Hill as professional staff on the U.S. House of Representatives Committees on Armed Services and Government Operations. So today, we're thrilled to hear from Joe. He's going to give us his thoughts on the arc and narrative of the nuclear revolution and the tragedy of American nuclear policy. So please join me in welcoming Joe Cirincione.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Colin. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you. You know how much I value your work and your contribution in and out of government. It was a pleasure to work with you closely on getting the landmark Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action that stopped the Iran nuclear program in its tracks, rolled it back, stopped a war. And it's one of those many, many achievements that we've now seen rolled back in the last few years. So my theme here of tragedies really fits in with how many people feel about what's going on in this country now, about the advances that we made on many fronts over the last few years, only to see them so rapidly thrown in reverse. And I want to take the opportunity here to try out a new speech, what may become an article, may become a book. And I want to use the academic atmosphere you have here, the constructive criticism can't even say the word, the constructive criticism that you might give me to see what am I getting right, what am I getting wrong. So this is the first time I'm trying this out, and I appreciate any feedback you could give me. My normal kinds of speeches, the kind of things I've been giving over the last few years, usually I'd be coming here giving a report on what's happening in Washington, a behind-the-scenes look. Is the W93 that the department, that the administration wants to build, is that a new nuclear weapon or not? What does it mean that we're deploying low-yield, more usable nuclear warheads on our strategic submarines? Are we really going to increase the nuclear budget all this much, and can we afford to do that? What are the prospects for New START? What does it mean that Russia and the U.S. seem to be agreeing to a meeting of the P5 at the UN Security Council in September, et cetera, et cetera? But I'm not going to talk about any of that. Any about that kind of like bump and grind of nuclear policy, that kind of daily, monthly, yearly stuff that we do, because this is the 75th anniversary of the birth of the nuclear weapon, the dawn of the nuclear age, and it's a time for us to sort of look back and reflect on this and think sort of big and think about what this means for us. What is the the narrative of the nuclear age? What is its meaning for us as a country, for us as a civilization? It's worth re-examining the story of nuclear weapons, and it's the story that you have heard in numerous classes here at Stanford, how we have come to mythologize these devices, weaving them in to the very fabric of the American tapestry. And for me, when I go back and I look at that story, this is not an adventure story. This is not some exciting tale of scientific triumph, and it's certainly not a comedy. It's a tragedy. The Greeks, along with many other inheritances, gave us tragedy. But for them, it was not purely entertainment. Tragedy was a sacred ritual for them, an education even. They believed that the best way to avoid societal catastrophe was to instill the lessons of tragedy into their citizen body. The themes that permeated their plays, self-fulfilling prophecies, the cost of hubris, the inane cycles of revenge were not just good storytelling, they could be matters of civic life and death. So when we look at nuclear weapons through that lens, what can you see except tragedy? A weapon designed to make us safe stripped us of any semblance of that safety. Something we thought would be our ultimate security became our ultimate threat. A nation wrapped in the laurels of victory was driven into a policy of madness by its fear. Leaders who abhorred the bombs on moral grounds were powerless to abolish them. And a country founded on the ideas of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness were prepared to kill half the planet in defense of those principles. We are, in a sense, trapped by our own creation, stuck between the horrific potentiality of nuclear war and the political impossibility of nuclear abolition. So far, we've avoided the ultimate tragedy, but often, as Secretary Perry has pointed out, by sheer luck. We're here and often by the skin of our teeth. Can we live like this forever? Maybe. Bertrand Russell once said, "You can reasonably expect a man to walk a tightrope safely for 10 minutes. It would be unreasonable to do so without accident for 200 years. So 75 years in, what are the prospects for us going another 75 years with these arsenals? We don't have to live with this kind of danger. We don't have to live with this kind of risk. Nothing about this story is inevitable. We can choose now, 75 years later, to learn the lessons of the tragedy and to end it entirely. But to do that, we have to come to grips with this story. And for those of us who are engaged in this field, for those of us who teach, who write, who still go on TV, who talk in the halls of government, this is a chance for us in this 75 years to engage the American public in a way when for a few minutes at least, we have their attention on this issue. Maybe it'll be in the anniversary of Trinity. Maybe it'll be the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bomb. But we have a chance to frame this story for them when the American public, for the moment, shifts its attention to this before they move on to their more day-to-day lives. For me, the bomb was born in tragedy. We didn't have to create it. This is not the audience that needs to hear about the origins of the nuclear bomb. You know about Leo Szilard. You know about Albert Einstein. You know about the letter they sent urging Roosevelt to begin a program. Why? Because they thought that Adolf Hitler was doing it. They thought the Nazis were building the bomb. And they needed the bomb not to use it. In the beginning, there was no thought of ever using this as a device. The scientists who understood what its destructive force could be wanted to use it as a deterrent. The only reason to build it was because they thought Hitler was doing it, and we needed to have a deterrent to prevent him from using it, to prevent him from winning the war with this super weapon. But we now know that Hitler was not building it. We knew that actually soon, even during the war, and it's become absolutely clear for a whole variety of reasons, including that Germany was the wrong country at the wrong time in the wrong place to build a bomb. It was because Hitler was Hitler, who didn't care about these kinds of devices, had his own crazy prejudices. He was filled with a fundamental distrust of innovations. He was very much a creature of his past and wanted to replicate the kinds of forces. It was one thing if it was better tanks and better guns, but he had to be won over even to any kind of research on the jet engines, which the Nazis invented, became too late. His view of nuclear physics in particular was hopelessly confused by his pathological anti-Semitism. He called it Jewish physics. So there never was a sustained program in Germany, even if there was, as Werner Heisenberg pointed out after. He says, we were asked often why Germany made no attempt to produce atomic bombs, and he said it's because the project could not have succeeded under German war conditions. Resources were devoted to the weapons they needed immediately, and even if they had been able to construct the installations for developing nuclear weapons, for making the nuclear fuel, they could have been easily bombed and taken out of commission. So there were ways to prevent Hitler from getting the bomb besides us building this deterrent. And of course, we defeated Nazi Germany before we had perfected the bomb, and Japan did not have a program, but we used it anyway on Japan. And this continues to be a controversy, but for me, there was no need to use that bomb. We did not need to use the bomb to end the war. And I know there are many who have personal experiences, like our friend George Schultz, who was a Marine at the time, was, I think, on a troop ship heading to the Pacific at the time of the bombing, and personally feels that the atomic bomb saved his life and hundreds of thousands of other GIs coming back. But we know that the United States Strategic Bombing Survey found after the war that Japan would have surrendered even if the atomic bombs had not been dropped, even if Russia had not entered the war. The defeat of Japan was almost certain. Did the bomb contribute to the Japanese decision? Almost certainly. Was it necessary for that decision? No, I don't think it was. So it's another tragic consequence of the very beginning of the nuclear age. And then what happened was even more tragic. We missed a number of opportunities right after the war to control the weapon for various reasons. And again, this crowd doesn't need to hear from me about the missed opportunities, about what went wrong with the Lilienthal plan, about why the Soviets rejected our efforts to control the bomb. But we missed that moment, and after 1949, when the Russians had their own weapon, we were then off to the races. And in the 1950s, the US went nuclear nuts. We went from about 400 weapons in 1950 to over 20,000 by 1960. The Soviet arsenal likewise jumped from about 5 warheads in 1950 to 1,600 in 1960. So we had 20,000. They only had about 2,000. We were ahead, but we were afraid. There was a fear that gripped the United States like nothing else in our history. As Robert Oppenheimer said, our 20,000th bomb, useful as it may be in filling the vast munition pipelines of a great war, does not in any deep strategic sense offset their 2,000th. We didn't need 20,000 nuclear weapons to be safe. There was no strategic rationale for this, but the machinery of building these weapons had taken over the policy process. These were the magic weapons. Everybody had to have them. We started pumping out nuclear weapons for every conceivable military mission, from strategic bombing to bazookas. My favorite nuclear weapon is the Davy Crockett, the recoilless rifle, a 2-person rifle that could fire a sub-kiloton warhead about a half a mile, maybe less. Why anyone would want to fire a nuclear weapon a half a mile is beyond me.
That's why. Include the guy
That's right. So it was a suicide weapon. Even the Army figured this out, and we discontinued it in the 60s. As Richard Rhodes wrote in The Arsenals of Folly, the large growth that we saw in the nuclear weapons production of the 50s and 60s was primarily driven by the capacity of the production complex and not truly by military requirements. I would argue that is a tendency we still see today. he quotes a designer at Sandia who notes that it was our policy at the time not to wait for requirements from the military, but to find out from the technologies that were available what the art of the possible would be. This is still what we're seeing today in the development of new warheads whose purpose is not clear, whose military requirements are vague at best. We did not need to go further than the atomic bomb. I wrote in my book, Bomb Scare, about the tragedy of the race to build the super, the race to build the H-bomb, how this was primarily a political decision. We knew how to build it, and after the Soviets detonated their H-bomb, Truman was given advice by some, Edward Teller in particular, that we should race to build the H-bomb. He asked his scientific advisors whether we should do it. And many people don't know this story. Oppenheimer was the head of the General Advisory Committee to the Atomic Energy Commission, and they came back in a unanimous position of their 8-member group: we should not build the H-bomb. We do not need this weapon. Even if Russia should develop, our atomic bombs would be able to offset that weapon, able to deter the use of the H-bomb. They called it a weapon of genocide. There was no valid military purpose for this weapon. It carries much further than the atomic bomb itself, they said, the policy of extermination of civilian populations. But that, of course, is the weapon that we now have. We have approximately 2,000 hydrogen bombs ready for use on a moment's notice in our operational ready-to-use stockpile. The Russians have a similar amount. There's also, for me, the tragedy of what nuclear weapons contributed to in the creation of the national security state and the enterprise we still live with here. Richard Barnett writes that the national security state structures could not accomplish their task unless the American people were socialized to accept the idea that the only peace possible is a form of permanent war. The threat of one sort or another to justify the continuous flow of resources to the military is now a fixture of American life. I think that is true today. I think this fear factor is used constantly to justify the structures that we currently have, to justify one of the largest defense budgets in U.S. history. We are now spending $750 billion this year's budget on Pentagon spending. That's more than we spent in any period of the Cold War, including the Vietnam War, the Korean War, the Reagan buildup, with the exception of the couple of years around the invasion of Iraq. There's the economic tragedy of nuclear weapons, the cost of these weapons. We've just been, Tom Collina and I have just been consulting with Stephen Schwartz, the editor, or the author of Atomic Audit, of Atomic Audit. And his current estimate is that we've spent about $10 trillion on nuclear weapons and related programs over these last 75 years. If we continue on the modernization pace that we're on, the Congressional Budget Office estimates that we'll spend another $2 trillion, about $1.7 trillion in inflation-adjusted dollars over the next 25 years or so to recapitalize the nuclear force, to build new bombers, submarines, missiles, and warheads to replace those built during the Reagan years and now wearing out. So we're going to spend about 20% of all the money we've ever spent on nuclear weapons in the next 25 years in rebuilding this weapon. This is an enormous resource, and one that is starting to get this as an aside, one that starts to get the attention of many of the groups and organizations and movements out there who want the US government to be spending money on different priorities, on a Green New Deal, or on Medicare for all, or on improving the infrastructure and providing housing. You can't do the kinds of things many progressives are encouraging the government to do if you're spending that kind of money on nuclear weapons. So there is a nuclear piggy bank out there that I believe is going to see raids on it in the very near future. And if their new president is elected in November, certainly starting in revised budgets in 2021. Just to give you some perspective of how much money that is, how much is $10 trillion if you stacked it up in $1 bills with every inch being $200 worth of money. If you stacked it up in $1 bills, it would go to the moon and back to the moon and halfway back. That's how much $10 trillion is. It's an enormous sum of money, and we have, in my view, wasted most of that on weapons we don't need. The current budget is, in the current administration's request, is about $75 billion for nuclear weapons. It is a big jump on what we've been spending. And Representative Thornberry, the ranking Republican on the House Armed Services Committee, just predicted yesterday that the nuclear budget issue is going to be the biggest controversy in the House consideration of the bill. You've already seen, I guess I am slipping into some Washington talk. You're seeing Adam Smith say that he wants to claw back some of the $3 billion increase that was granted to the NNSA, the National Nuclear Security Agency, for new warhead work. A big, big jump. Amount of money, by the way, that was opposed inside the Trump administration by the Office of Management and Budget, by the Secretary of Energy, but NNSA got the $3 billion anyway when Republicans in the Congress appealed to Trump, and Trump intervened and gave them that request. Will that survive? That's an interesting story to follow all by itself. But $75 billion in total. That includes about $30 billion for new weapons, $20 billion for new warheads, $5.8 billion for cleanup, mostly for Hanford and Savannah River, and I count $20 billion for what they are now calling missile defeat and defense programs, a big jump in the so-called missile defense budget. So about $75 billion altogether for nuclear weapons and related programs. You know, Eisenhower warned us long ago about this military-industrial complex. He said that this is not a way of life at all in any true sense. Under the cloud of threatening war, it is humanity hanging from a cross of iron. I think a good part of that cross is radioactive at this point. We are strapped to this burden of nuclear weapons, and we don't know how to shake it. I just wrote an essay in a blog called Responsible Statecraft, just published today. And I was basically encouraging all those who are, whatever candidate they're supporting, to take some of the best ideas from the other candidates in the race. And in this case, I'm referencing Elizabeth Warren's ideas for procurement reform. And she has a plan for reform. And that plan includes going right at the subject of the military budget and not being afraid to tackle that budget, and goes right at the issue of corruption inside the military procurement system. And I agree with her. I think our military procurement system is corrupt. It is broken. It is dominated, as she says, by 5 large defense contractors. And all the papers, all the books, all the articles, all the debate we write are insignificant against that force, that procurement force that gets these ideas, these programs, these contracts through the Pentagon, through the Congress. And a big part of that problem is the revolving door, and she wants to close it, to have a ban on people taking jobs with the very contractors they're regulating, or coming from that contracting world to then oversee government programs that would bestow contracts on their former and potentially future corporations, employers rather. I worked on revolving door legislation when I was in the House, and I really do believe this is one of the keys to trying to get a grip on our military spending, and that includes on our nuclear spending. To me, it's personally outrageous that the former acting Secretary of Defense was a Boeing lobbyist and that the current Secretary of Defense is a Raytheon lobbyist. That is just no way to ensure the integrity of our government. There's another whole element of this tragedy, and that's one we don't talk about too much in circles like this, and that's the environmental tragedy. The very first bomb was born in environmental tragedy. The people don't know very much about the mines in the Belgian Congo, the mines that they call Shinkolobre, where there was slave labor used to extract the mine, either direct slave or debt slave labor. Thousands lost their lives in pulling out the uranium. 2/3 of the uranium in the Hiroshima bomb came from those Belgian mines. And then we compounded the problem itself with the mining we did in the Navajo Nation. Mining companies blasted out some 4 million tons of uranium out of territories occupied by the Navajo people between 44 and 86. And when they left over 500 pits, 500 empty mines that filled with water, that became pools, that kids swam in, that livestock grazed in, poisoning those people, poisoning that livestock. Cancer rates doubled in the Navajo Nation from the 1970s to the 1990s as a result of this pollution. Plowshares Fund is proud to fund a grantee, a woman named Lovely Umayam, who has just finished a virtual reality production that I was pleased to see. I don't know, have you seen this?
She was one of my early interns at State.
Is that right?
She's really talented.
She's quite gifted. And it's called Ways of Knowing, and it's how the Navajo people telling their story, and you can sit there in their buildings and listen to their tales. This isn't so much an untold story as it is an unlistened to story. They've been telling it. We haven't really been paying attention, but it's one of those tragic spots, those tragic aspects of these weapons that we have to keep in mind. And of course, there's the better known stories, the better listened to stories of the downwinders, of the victims of the testing in Nevada. A 2017 study suggested that the fallout from the Nevada nuclear testing led to between 34,000 and 460,000 premature deaths, mostly Americans, mainly through cancer. It's to give some perspective of the amount of radiation that was generated by these tests. One estimate in this study, this is from a University of Arizona study, estimated that the Nevada-based nuclear testing emitted 12 billion curies into the atmosphere between 51 and 63. That's the equivalent of nearly 150 Chernobyl disasters, or one a month for more than a decade. And we did this to ourselves. It wasn't an accident. We just did it, and then we ignored the consequences or denied the consequences. Well, when we talk about the history of nuclear weapons, this is part of the history. This is part of the cost of these weapons. There's also the effects on testing in the Marshall Islands. And I got to admit, for most of my time in this field, I didn't care. This wasn't a subject that interested me. It wasn't relevant to the debates I was having on Capitol Hill or the books I was writing. But you can't ignore this. Between 46 and 58, the U.S. detonated 67 nuclear devices in the Marshall Islands that had a cumulative radioactive yield of more than 7,000 Hiroshima bombs. Radioactive fallout from those tests devastated people's health. We believe that radioactivity has caused cancer or other disorders in at least 1,500 Marshallese. And it's, as you know, the genetic mutations from radioactivity span generations. It doesn't end with the people who were just exposed. It is passed on. It continues. And it's about to come back. That particular radioactive horror is like Godzilla about to rise again from the depths of the sea. The Runit Dome that we constructed to hold this nuclear waste in the Marshall Islands holds more than 3.1 million cubic feet, or 35 Olympic-sized swimming pools of US-produced radioactive soil and debris. And now that concrete coffin is cracking. I sometimes get asked about the intersection of nuclear and climate change, the two existential threats to humanity. Well, in this case, you can see it directly. Why is that concrete coffin cracking? Because of rising seas and other effects of climate change. Tides are creeping up its sides, advancing higher every year as distant glaciers melt and ocean waters rise. Officials in the Marshall Islands have lobbied the US government for help, but American officials have declined, saying the dome is on Marshallese land and therefore the responsibility of Marshallese government. Now, I know there are people in this government that care about this issue. I'm talking about the approach overall of the government, the net result of the approach is this. And it gets even worse. We actually shipped 130 tons of radioactive soil from the atomic testing grounds in Nevada to the Marshall Islands. They became our nuclear dumping ground. We have a responsibility there. It's not black and white. It's not like we're not doing anything. We are, but the net result is still a horror story for the people in that region. Okay, the tragedies continue. For me, this just gets worse and worse, and here's the ultimate environmental tragedy of nuclear weapons. It's that new techniques, new methodology, new climate tools help us predict with greater accuracy what the effect would be of nuclear use. Many of you are familiar with the nuclear winter estimates that Carl Sagan and others led during the 1980s, and you've seen what Alan Robach and Brian Toon and others have done updating their study. Robach and Toon and others are now nearing the end of a 3-year, $3 million study to update their findings more completely, and they've released a partial result of their research to date, and they're getting very precise about this, that a South Asia exchange, an India-Pakistan exchange involving as few as 100 nuclear weapons, and remember in South Asia, these would be atomic weapons, would kill about 20 million people directly, but they would put enough smoke and particulate in the atmosphere that within a week or two, the Earth would be shrouded by clouds. Temperatures in the northern hemisphere would become colder than those experienced during the pre-industrial little ice age. They would drop about 2 or 3 degrees. That means that, you say, well, maybe that's an answer to global warming. But unfortunately, that also means that about 40% of the food crops in the northern hemisphere would be destroyed at those altitudes. It would become too cold, for example, to grow wheat in most of Canada. World grain stocks would be devastated. Food shortages would cause hundreds of millions to starve to death. Some studies predict a 1 billion-person famine. That's just from using 100 atomic weapons. Finally, I just think there's a moral tragedy to this. A moral tragedy to the fact that we have become used to having these weapons in our arsenal, that we become so, these weapons have become so integrated that we have secretaries of defense describing them as the backbone of America's national security, as the foundation of American national security. But they are, as Robert Oppenheimer called them, still weapons of genocide. We know that the politicians have struggled with this from the very beginning. You know, after Nagasaki, there was a third bomb that we were thinking of dropping on Japan, and Truman stopped it. Truman stopped it. He didn't see the point. He said he didn't like the idea of the killing of, he said, all those kids. Because, of course, that's who these weapons kill, not military, but men, women, and children. But we then went on to develop plans that estimated, and you know this better than I do, there would be hundreds of millions of people killed in a U.S. strike on Russian targets. Same on the Russian side. Daniel Ellsberg describes this in his Doomsday Machine. If the PSYOP that he helped work on in the early 60s was ever implemented, he estimated there would be a total of 1 billion people killed in that strike. There's no military mission that I can think of that justifies that kind of slaughter. And of course, this is just the direct slaughter. This is before you start to take into account the climate change. But here's the worst part for me. Even if you justify, you know, having those weapons and thinking, well, we're never going to use them, we're there for the deterrence, it's what they say about what we're willing to do. Because in order for deterrence to work, we have to be willing to do this. And we have to convince the enemy that we are willing to do this. And we have to practice doing this every day. And this has led the Catholic Church to take a very strong stand over the years, but even more so in recent years, against these weapons, against the morality of the weapons. The Catholic Church now holds that it is immoral to have nuclear weapons for any purpose, including for deterrence. Pope Francis just said in Nagasaki in November of last year, peace and international stability are incompatible with attempts to build upon the fear of mutual destruction. In a world where millions of children and families live in inhuman conditions, the money that is squandered and the fortunes made through the manufacturer, upgrading, maintenance, and sale of ever more destructive weapons are an affront crying to heaven. That is exactly how I feel. This is an affront. That is exactly how I feel. But for most of our existence, for most of our discussion about this, we just treat this as sort of these abstract ideas, these concepts, this unproven theory of deterrence based on no empirical data, just beliefs that we have come to hold. And the final tragedy of all this is that all this is repeating. It's not going away. We have a new generation of young Dr. Strangeloves rising up, proposing the Cold War ideas of the 50s and 60s as if they are new thinking, as if they have some role in the world today. I know these people. My friend Keir Lieber used to be my research assistant. Elbridge Colby, a brilliant young man, now at Center for New American Security. I've debated Matt Kroenig on the NewsHour. Matt has a new book, a couple of years old, The Logic of American Nuclear Strategy, and he talks very blandly about why we should have these weapons and why we could absorb a strike. If worst came to worst, it would be okay. Not saying we won't get our hair mussed, but it would be fine. Even 2,000 one-megaton explosions, he says, would directly demolish less than 5% of the territory of the United States, kill less than 10% of the population. He argued that we don't have too many weapons, we don't have enough nuclear weapons. A recent technical study found that to promptly kill 100% of Russia's population would require an enemy nuclear attack with approximately 140,000 nuclear warheads. And then he argues the logic, as they did in the 50s and 60s, and when I got into this field during the debate over the window of vulnerability in the late 70s, early 80s, he points out that U.S. casualties in a second strike against Russia would be 70 million, but if we struck first, they could be limited to 28 million. And these kinds of calculations are now making the rounds again. And you see statements like we just saw last week from the new head of the Strategic Command, Admiral Charles Richards, pointing out the new W-93 warhead as something that he said makes me proud to be an American. Proud to be an American, the new 93 warhead. And here's where I'd like to leave this talk before I hear your comments and criticisms and suggestions. That not only do I believe we have a responsibility to talk about nuclear weapons in this way to the American people in this year, but I think we have to get ready for making a change in our nuclear policy. We have an election in November. If Donald Trump is reelected, there's the possibility that he can make a dramatic change to U.S. nuclear policy. After all, Ronald Reagan did. After a first term of buildup, he became one of the greatest arms control presidents in American history. Could Trump do that? Could he make a deal with the Russians? Could he actually bring the Chinese into this? Could he negotiate a better deal with Iran? Could he finally negotiate a deal with North Korea? I think the odds are low. I don't think he's that type of person. I don't think he knows how to do it, but it's possible. And we have to, if that's the hand we're dealt after November, we're going to have to do everything we can to try to convince him to take that road. But if there's a Democrat elected, if it's Joe or Bernie or Elizabeth, we have a new opportunity for a new nuclear posture. We have a new opportunity for a new nuclear plan. We have a chance to correct some of these tragedies, to reduce some of these tragedies, to change our policy so these tragedies start to end, that we get serious arms control back on record, that we could start, of course, by saving the arms control treaties that we have. The new president will have to scramble to keep the New START treaty alive. They will have to find new avenues to the Russians. But most of all, they will have to readjust the American military budget. The new president can decide that we don't need a new ICBM. We certainly don't need to rush into a decision to build a new ICBM. We can afford to take our time to consider alternatives, to explore new arms control measures that might make a new ICBM unnecessarily, even in the standard level of analysis. The new president could change U.S. nuclear policy like that, declaring that we no longer need to have our ICBMs, our weapons ready to launch in a minute's notice, that we will never be the first to start a nuclear war, and to find new ways to make sure that any decision to go to nuclear war is a joint decision, is not just the sole decision by the President of the United States, but involves the U.S. Congress, the only body in our Constitution that has the authority to declare war. There's a whole range of possibilities that will become possible with the new president, so there's some hope in this tragic story. But like the Greeks, if we're ever to learn these lessons, we have to at first experience this tragedy, experience the truth of what our history has been, not a myth that we've been repeating for these 75 years. I've gone on too long. Let me just stop there and open up for questions and discussion. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Hopefully you'll tell us what you think.
Dr. Perry, I will.
Joe, first of all, that was a brilliant summary. Quite impressive. But let me get to the punchline that you had at the end. In the president prior to Trump, Obama, no matter who wins in November, is knowledgeable, was passionate about going down the nuclear weapons, as Obama was when he was in office. And yet 2 years after Obama was into office, he was pulling away from this.
Yeah.
And he was agreeing to the nuclear build-up that you're talking about. What went wrong there? And what could we do to give us a better chance to get a different outcome for another person?
I've been talking to former Obama officials. I don't use the expression what went wrong. I talk to them about lessons learned. Knowing what we know now, what would we have done differently? And their responses are remarkably similar. So Ben Rhodes or Lynn Rustin, Ivo Daalder, others, and some privately, not on record, like Dennis McDonough and others. And they argue that one, they overestimated how much time they had, or they underestimated how hard this was going to be. And their lesson is get as much done in the first year as possible. And they've learned a little bit from the audacity of the presidency that Trump has shown, that there's a lot the president can just do. And that, for example, in the nuclear posture review, don't ask the bureaucracy to produce a new review. Tell the bureaucracy what you want the policy to be. There's a lesson of people. They actually thought they could run most of this from the White House, and they were wrong, and they didn't put enough people in the right agencies who actually believed in what they were doing, and they found out there was a lot of resistance from their own people to carrying out the desires of the president. There's issues, of course, as you know, with the Russians themselves refusing to negotiate a new treaty. The whole plan was for New START to be the quick fix. This was just to keep the verification and inspection regime going, and then, hey, we picked up some reductions along the way. That was almost a bonus, but that was supposed to be the quick fix. Remember, Medvedev and Obama agreed to that almost instantly. It was April of 2009 when they reached agreement on this, and they thought they could quickly negotiate it. The Russians dug in their heels. The negotiations there are people here.
1 year wasn't bad.
1 year wasn't bad for doing this. But what that meant was that then they were coming to the U.S. Senate in 2010 for ratification, and the Republicans, they ran into the second roadblock. The Republicans were not about to give a Democratic president a victory in an election year. And they dragged it out until the very last day, and some didn't want to give it to him. It took to the last day of the Senate in 2010 to get that, and by then, the team was exhausted. I haven't actually talked to you about how you felt, but I tell you anecdotally, I know there's a lot of White House officials who never wanted to hear the word arms control again. This had taken up a huge portion of the president's attention, and he had a few other things to deal with, and he moved on to the other issues. The modernization program, hold on just a second, the modernization program was a reasonable, I didn't like it at the time, but it was an $88 billion pledge to modernize, particularly some areas that needed modernization. As long as you have nuclear weapons, they have to be kept safe and reliable, right? So, but they never thought that they were going to have to recapitalize the whole triad because there would be another arms control agreement that would get into deep cuts. They never got that other arms control agreement. The arms control stopped, but the contracts continued, and it has morphed into this $2 trillion monstrosity that we're now stuck with.
I just think you should consider the Aegis Ashore issue, because in 2009, the decision was probably the worst decision, probably as bad a decision in terms of its implications for arms control as the decision of the earlier administration to leave the Abm Treaty, because the Aegis Ashore was unbounded in a mobile system.
So it stirred Russian concerns that we were
went through the roof with the Russians.
we were actually planning a national missile defense
I
system.
spent a lot of time talking to Russians about it.
Well, Putin cited this himself when he disclosed.
So I think the important, I'm not trying to
Yeah, I
put
know.
figures, I think it's important to understand how decisions that were made caused reactions on the Russian side as well. I think it's a convenient thing for people to always point their fingers at the Russians. They sometimes should have fingers pointed at them, but you know, the Obama administration had no idea what it was doing. I know for a fact. I've talked to Mike McFaul about this. He has no idea what they did, you know, and why they did it. I mean, it's crazy. These guys just got together in the White House and decided this will look good for the administration politically. And of course, it was a total disaster.
There was,
Scott was next.
and there was.
My comment's more on rhetoric and style than on the W93 or the Abm Treaty. It's been a long time since I've taken an English literature class, but I always thought that the biggest difference between Greek tragedy and English tragedy had to do with the inevitability of flaws. Discussions here, so maybe Russia.
Ooh, good.
Correct me, but Greeks often think how tragic it is that this happened because of who people are, because of the way we're made. While English tragedy, Shakespeare and others, is how tragic it is because it could have been otherwise very easily had someone not made a bad decision or a bad choice. And it strikes me that most of what you're doing is English tragedy. Identifying some people who made really bad choices. And you're not saying it's a flaw in human beings because of revenge motives or because of stupidity. You're saying it is something that could have been very different had some things been done differently. And therefore, it seems to me that you could package this somewhat differently. Not
It's good.
But starting with Shakespeare or something.
Good.
And thinking about some individual choices. You start with Truman, but you don't really label what he chose wrong.
Yes.
What was there. Or
Yes.
Eisenhower, what he chose. Or more recently, or Trump, what they chose wrong. And I'd love to see little play vignettes or that, you know, the tragedy of choices that
That's
could have
good.
been different, rather than this broad theme of tragedy.
Well, that's you. Yes. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. I mean, I have to go back and read Hamlet. I have to. You're right. I think that's exactly right. As soon as you said it, I realized the mistake I'm making here, because I do think of it that way, like Reykjavik. Like Reykjavik. That's the tragedy of missed opportunities. They really wanted to get rid of all nuclear weapons. And we know the transcripts. We talked to George Shultz. We talked to the people in there. They were real close. They were moving up the chain of getting rid of all of them, but they couldn't agree because of a stumble over Star Wars, right? Gorbachev wanted the SDI program combined in the kept in the laboratory for 10 years. Reagan saw that as a necessary insurance policy in case anything went wrong. Gorbachev thought it was something he had to bring back the chiefs. Either one of them could have agreed to the other's position and it wouldn't have mattered. The stuff didn't work. It stayed in the laboratory. It's still in the laboratory. None of those programs worked. We could have agreed to that. Gorbachev didn't have anything to fear. Reagan didn't have anything to fear. That was one of the great tragedies of the nuclear age, that we missed that opportunity. We haven't come close to that since.
I think I had
Excellent.
there was a two-finger back here.
We do have an English professor here too.
Okay, so so let's get a two-finger maybe on the history and the two-finger on the literature piece. So David, and then in the back, go ahead, please.
Yeah, I'm not following up on tragedy, though I agree with the term, however you want to define it. But if you take Scott's intervention, and it's the tragedy of bad decisions, then it can't just be an American story.
Yes.
It's because the decisions elicit responses that people may not anticipate. If it's a story just about Washington, and about Washington getting all the right decisions, that deprives the rest of the world of any agency. People are not allowed to make their own mistakes in that case, to be part of the tragedy. And so, for example, you mentioned, withdrawal from the Abm Treaty. Well, we know that after that, certain key decisions were taken in Moscow about new systems. The language was mild in response, but I talked to somebody who was working in the Security Council at the time. He said, we took some very tough decisions about what we would do to be sure we could always overcome a ballistic missile defense or even totally circumvent the systems that were then in mind. And we've seen the results actually recently. So also, if you take...
Just on that for a second, when you say other countries, so Russia's clearly the other, or Soviet's clearly the other country. Others as well?
No, I think so too.
China, India, Pakistan,
India.
Israel.
Yes, well, there's several things. In one case, it's a decision where somebody responds to what you're doing or may do to them. The other is example. You structure a certain kind of nuclear force and say this is what any stable force should look like. You have the triad. Well, people look at that and say, oh, yes, that's a good idea. So I think the power of American concepts and ideas of the thinkers of the 50s and 60s is actually very far-reaching. Persistent. Yeah, and not only in the Soviet Union, where of course it was kind of denied or covered up, but in South Asia too. In China, I'm less clear, but I think there too, to some degree. It's not that they don't have their own ideas. Part of it is just saying, I'm very sympathetic to your approach, especially to your final kind of coda on the morality. It's that we have to convince ourselves that we would do things that are totally, beyond the moral pale. But in the end, it's a tragedy that we share. It's not only the U.S., others are involved in it too.
So there's
Thank
a
you.
two-finger in the back, and then I'll get to Rose. So yeah.
Well, just to go back, Scott pointed out the tragic question, and of course he's right. Shakespearean tragedy is interested in something called the tragic flaw that people wrongly associate with Aristotle. But there is something in Greek tragedy that also fits, I think, and that is the concept of touche, which just means basically what you run into on the road. Chance, accident. Oedipus running into his father, not knowing it's his father, and killing him. And that is an enormous purchase in the whole issue of nuclear weapons, because we assume there won't be any accidents. We're all going to, and that's, I don't know if you know it better than I. And I could just add one other thing from personal experience. I just came back from an anti-nuclear protest this weekend up at the Trident sub base in Washington State, which has, as you probably know, probably the largest concentration of nuclear weapons in the world in one spot.
Yeah.
In this group of peaceful Catholics that protest very, very calmly about these things, but do it again and spend a lot of time in jail, they showed a short little 8.5-minute video called "What If We Nuked the City?" And it's just an animated film, probably made 15 years ago. I would just encourage everybody to see it and tell anybody they know to see it, because what it reminds you of, which we all know, I grew up with this, as a kid, stocking cover, all that stuff. But what it reminds you is how amazingly destructive these things are. And you see it again, and you cannot believe that there are 5,800 of them in the U.S. arsenal, I don't know how many in the rest of them. So I sent it to a few friends. Everybody who thought they knew said, my God, I forgot. And I would just say, in addition to all of this good, smart stuff, that if we reanimated people's understanding of what they actually do, people would just go, shit, we don't want to be around this stuff. And there's no good argument for it. And I mean, anyway, there's a little thought for me.
That cartoon was actually only issued a few months ago.
Oh, was it? Okay. Oh, I didn't know. I thought it was over.
Well, there is a new one.
What's the name of it?
What if we nuke a city? It's not about nuclear war, it's about one nuclear bomb going off, I can't remember the size, around the size of Hiroshima, maybe a little bit bigger. And it just shows you the devastation that continues to happen and on and on. It's pretty powerful.
So I would just say whatever literary hook used at the beginning, already in the discussion, tragedy has been used kind of in 4 different ways, right? One is that there's certain tragedy that might be inherent in human nature. So fear, suspicion, greed, power, right? Revenge. The second is flawed decision-making. The third is chance. And a fourth, which hasn't been mentioned, but we're in a room full of a number of IR scholars, would be the strategic or structural environment. And this is one of the ways to get agency back. But this is, to David's point, I guess it has been already introduced, which is a kind of action-reaction. The tragedy of the security dilemma, the tragedy of the spiral model. And I think that your story touches on all those aspects of tragedy, and it would be worth intellectually probably teasing out which ones, because actually some of them introduce more possibility for human agency than others. The more it's hardwired into us or the strategic environment, the harder it is to get out. The more it is rooted in flawed decision, then the more agency we have. Anyway, to this point, you overstand me, but I think that the 4 different points, the 4 different types of tragedy, maybe there are more, are worth teasing out. Rose, you've been very patient.
Thank you. Really compelling presentation, Joe. Thank you.
Well, you're kind.
I did want to go back to Bill Perry's point, though, about the Obama administration and the Prague.
That's 2 of the idiots in the Obama administration who didn't know what they were doing.
Who were great enthusiasts. No, but there was this true moment of great public enthusiasm at the dawn of the Obama administration, and it went until, really until New START ratification. There was public euphoria, interest was gripping, people cared, they knew about it. But then, I don't know if the public also became exhausted or what happened. Everybody's got their own concerns day in, day out. There's no more duck and cover drills, et cetera, et cetera. So you said right at the outset that this is a moment where you want to see the American public engage, and you present a compelling case, but how are you going to engage the American public? Having, really broken my head against the wall of trying to interest the American public in this. You can do it if there's something going on that dominates the news cycle, like a president giving a big speech where everyone feels the hope and the positive aspect, or you finally get an arms control treaty through the Senate and everybody's excited about that. But it's an ephemeral engagement. So how are you going to get the American public engaged and keep them engaged?
You want an answer, or you're just
No, because you said.
Okay, well, I'll tell you. I'll tell you what I'm thinking about that now.
Yeah.
We are not going to have a new mass anti-nuclear movement like the 80s. Right. The largest demonstration in U.S. history was 1 million people in Central Park in 1982 over the arms race until January 21st, 2017, when the Women's March brought 1.5 million, which is now. And that Women's March also accelerated or set off or was symptomatic or a part of a new mass mobilization in this country. In part in reaction to Trump, but also because of all the structural challenges that are inherent in our society and people want changed. And so whether it's the high school kids at Parkland reinvigorating the gun control movement, or the kids in the Sunrise movement coming up with the Green New Deal, or Greta Thunberg doing the climate change, or it's the women's rights or human rights or Me Too. There are more Americans involved in the civic life of this country now, actively, in all kinds of ways, including running for office and taking back the U.S. Congress, than I've ever seen. So the key to this is not to have a new big mass anti-nuclear movement. It's to get those movements that are already in motion to see that this is part of the change they want to. Mm-hmm. And it's in some ways, in some areas, it's easy. You want a Green New Deal? Where are you going to get the money? You're going to have to get it from the military budget. You're going to have to get it from, and you can identify the nuclear budget in particular, if you don't want to cut ships, tanks, and planes, There's money there that you can have, and it's actual money. It's in government planning. It's there. You can divert it. You want Medicare for all, or at least a better Medicare system? Again, you got to take some of that 60% that's devoted to military spending, 60% of all discretionary spending, you got to move it. So there's a natural link for these, and we're already starting to see people make it. For some, one of the things we're doing at Plowshares, it's about women. It's about increasing the role of women's voices in nuclear policy. You know, women make up over half the population, but only 20% of those people involved in nuclear decision making. Well, why is that? We believe that if you increase the diversity of voices in the decision making, you would get better decisions. So there's ways to try to integrate these issues. So I don't know if we're going to have this kind of Prague moment in a new administration, but there may be more sort of structural ways that we can get that involvement. And for me, I think the key to it is not so much going to be the issues, the tragedies I talk about, but it's going to be the financial aspect, the budget. What do you think?
I think you need to link it up to the environmental energy that's up there, to the climate change.
Yes.
And all of the stories you told are quite compelling about that. So you need to get that point. You need to get them meshed. It's not going to be easy. The Bulletin of the Atomic Scientist has been trying this for over a decade now.
To link them.
To mesh those two issues together, I think is a very good avenue to pursue as well.
Secretary Bear.
On those points, we always go to the heart of the problem. But at the heart of the problem is that the public doesn't understand the danger. And as long as they don't understand the danger, there's going to be a lack of the kind of impetus that worked behind the 1981 movements. So it seems to me that the first step is a mass education program, something which universities and foundations could take on. Maybe not successfully, but you could try it. But the stumbling block which the Obama administration ran into, I think, fundamentally, was that nobody in the public understood what the issues were and what the problems were. And so the public was not behind them in what they were trying to do.
And if I could just... Sorry,
Please, I'd like to hear this.
I just took note of the interest in the younger generations about the Chernobyl show that was on. There was more impact on my kids, your kids, younger people I know from watching the Chernobyl show in understanding the pitfalls of nuclear power programs. Maybe it's another HBO series. We
are finding that the millennials are much more active than the Gen Xers, that there's this new wave of interest in these issues. It's almost, and I think, I'm not exactly sure why, but one of the reasons is Trump. I mean, Trump has demonstrated the real nuclear dangers we face in a way that makes them immediate, that makes them concrete. Partially it's his rhetoric, partially it's the concern that an unstable individual has his hand on the nuclear button. And you're seeing reactions to this both out there in the public and in Congress. Nobody told Ted Lieu to introduce his legislation. It wasn't like some group went to him. He just understood a problem. He said, this is unacceptable. Or Adam Smith, both of them have introduced legislation to change the authority of the president to launch a nuclear weapon by themselves. So there's that. So that's another hook we have. If we get an opportunity with a new president in November, we'll have an opportunity for a little while to change that strategy. Remember, the president can do this. Congress doesn't have to do this. The president himself or herself can change what that doctrine is, and then seek Congress to enshrine it in law through congressional action. So the stuff you can do, if you have a plan, you can get a lot done in that first year in office.
Two-finger?
I'm trying to think back of all of the Democratic debates that I've heard, and I don't remember this being a theme that developed.
One time.
Detroit debate. The second,
One time.
Detroit debate.
But we've come back to Medicare every time. Repeatedly. Or something equivalent like that. So in part it's the moderators that don't consider it public interest.
Yes, that's true. Foreign policy overhaul has gotten short shrift, but in fact, they're following the polls. They're looking at what the American public care about and currently, while these debates are going on, foreign policy ranks very low on public's concerns.
Back to the education issue.
Yeah, it's back to the education issue.
Can I ask you a question as, oh, sorry.
Math education, but even small scale education, which is what we do at universities here, sometimes works. Ted Lou, you mentioned, was a student of mine, he was a student of Scott's. When he went here, he had these ideas already in his head.
So somebody did tell him.
He wrote his final paper on the Nagasaki decision. Yeah.
How'd he do?
Got an A?
This is a question.
Incomplete for his current work, though.
We have a question in the back. Before we tie this thread, though, I want to ask you a question that taps into your Washington experience. So there's a new movement afoot in Washington and foreign policy circles to challenge the establishment that comes where three different strands of thought, at the very least, are coming together to push for greater restraint on the use of force, right? So you have the kind of Cato libertarian side of the Republican Party. You have a certain segment of realists, self-described foreign policy realists, and then you have left-leaning progressives, all making the case for a less interventionist, less U.S. policy. So things like the Quincy Institute obviously epitomize this, but they're not. But that's not only that. Question though, my sense though is that there might be a profound left-right divide there between the role of nuclear weapons in such an anti-interventionist or restrained policy, because the Keir Liebers of the world are restraint folks. That is, if you're going to pull back, you actually need the ultimate weapon as the ultimate deterrent. So there will be a certain category of realists and people on the right who argue that as we pull back from the world militarily, we actually need nuclear weapons more. That doesn't mean we need to build more of them, but we certainly shouldn't get rid of them. Whereas I think the same folks who believe in the anti-interventionist stuff coming at it from the left are going to be more amenable to some of the rights-oriented arguments or environmental arguments or some of the arguments. So I wonder, does that make any sense? And do you see any of that? Is it irreconcilable?
Yes, I understand what you're saying. I can speak to the Cato and the left progressive elements who both want to decrease the role and number of nuclear weapons in U.S. national security policy. So the Cato Institute, for example, came out with a study a couple of years ago arguing for a dyad. We don't need the ICBM anymore. It's the most destabilizing of the weapons. It's the one that's most at risk of use from an insane president, et cetera. All the reasons we know. So they're on board with that. Decrease the military budget as part of it. So you see the libertarians do that. Same with the left progressives. And you don't have to believe that I do, like we should abolish nuclear weapons. You don't have to believe that they're immoral, as I do, that we shouldn't have them for any reason. There's a whole lot of unity between what we have and where we should go. You can get down to under 1,000. You can get down to hundreds, and that would be enormous progress, and every step we make makes us safer. So there's a lot of unity over here, and let's get back in the reduction business, the business we've been in since Ronald Reagan, the business we've been in for 30 years that has now stopped. The reduction business has stopped. We've flatlined here. There's 13,500 weapons in the world. There used to be almost 70,000. We've made remarkable progress. The last 30 years has been a real hopeful story, not tragic at all in this part. You know, fewer weapons, fewer countries that want these weapons, really brought down the proliferation threat to 2 countries, North Korea and Iran, not dozens. Real success. And then we abandoned those policies. We just stopped doing what had been working for liberals and conservatives, Republicans and Democrats. So we have a chance to get back to that. That's why I think you'll see left progressives and the Cato libertarians agree. I don't know about the realists. I think you can get the realists on board with the reduction part. I don't know if you can get them on board with the elimination part. They might think it's unrealistic.
Yeah. I think some of the counterforce cowboys you're critical of fall in the restraint camp, but that's probably a fuller discussion for another time.
Well, I mean to have Keir Lieber on my podcast. I want to debate him.
Yes. Yep.
Yes, I'm Cheryl Spencer from the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, Disarm Committee, and I'm very happy to hear you say getting more women involved in policy decisions. This is one of Wilk's big pushes, is that there's not enough women at the tables where these policies are decided, where arms treaties are negotiated. So, yes, let's all keep pushing to get more women involved. With regard to trying to bring the public attention back to this, we did actually have, a lot of groups did have, we did write to those moderators at the presidential debates and ask them to include nuclear weapons. So there was some effort to do that, but there was no straight answer. So there is, in late April, we hope, the review of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty is going to happen at the UN. It's not cancelled like the Commission on the Status of Women at the UN was just cancelled because of the COVID-19. So we're hoping that will go ahead. And so it goes on for a whole month. And there should be lots of opportunities for the regular media to talk about the Non-Proliferation Treaty. And so that's, I'm going to be going there with, as a presentation with the UN. Okay. We have a whole afternoon when we can talk to the General Assembly about these issues. Statements are being made. I believe somebody from Ashore is part of the whole process of making statements. Anyway, so there is, things we can be doing, and there are many, many different groups out there working on against nuclear weapons, and so coordination is a good idea.
Good. Thank you. Thank you very much, and thank you for what you do.
Yes. So I'm Jim Harris. I was in the electrical engineering department. And when I was a student in the 60s, there was about 600 EE graduate students, one woman. And so what I discovered over the years, I graduated 138 PhD students, so I always had a large group. And I described it as the magic of three. So, and I was starting that, all right, you had one woman in the group, that was just sort of a token. And then two, well, it made a little bit of difference. But with three, they really formed a community that reinforced each other. And the whole culture of the group changed. And I believe that so strongly that I think corporate boards of directors and, the Supreme Court or committees and things, they ought to really have, if there's 10 or so people, there ought to be at least 3 women. That they form a community that changes the whole culture and the decision making.
Well, I agree with you.
And I mean,
not about the number, but
4 or 5 women in the group didn't make much more difference. But 3 was just a huge, huge difference.
So I have a podcast. Doesn't everybody have a podcast now? I have a podcast. I have a podcast. It's called Press the Button. And next week, we just finished recording the episode for next week where we're talking to one of our board members, Ambassador Pam Hamamoto, who was the U.S. representative to the international organizations in Geneva, where she started something called International Gender Champions.
Why don't we have her speak about that?
What's that?
Pam's here, so why not?
Oh, there she is. Right, of course. She said, I'm sorry, I forgot you were here. You were actually here. And so we had somebody, well, why don't you tell them? Why don't you tell them what you did? Because it's better than what you're suggesting. Was it Richard?
No.
Ted, yeah.
My name's Jim Harris.
Jim, sorry, Jim. It's actually better than what you're suggesting. Because we want you going out and got people to actually make commitments on gender equity.
Yeah, well, I was serving under President Obama as ambassador to the United Nations in Geneva. We launched a global leadership network where we had heads of international organizations and ambassadors, heads of NGOs, basically the leadership network in the whole ecosystem to make personal commitments on how they were going to advance gender equality in their organizations or in their programmatic work. We have currently over 250 of these gender champions around the world, and over 1,000 commitments have been made and delivered upon. That led to actually the formation of Gender Champions in Nuclear Policy, which is the House of Nuclear Threat Initiative, is something that Ashore's team and support. And it's kind of model goes the same way, driving a lot of progress in this area. We just actually are announcing a new $1 million women's initiative campaign to actually raise specific funds to put toward exactly what you're talking about and what you were talking about, is supporting more women in the field, getting more women voices heard, showcasing their expertise, supporting their organizations, so that we can have more than 0 or 1 woman at the table, hopefully more than even 3 at some point down the road. But we would love to talk to you more about it if you'd like.
Hey, yeah.
Your support for the campaign.
That's a good board member.
Right.
You know, if it's
Never
a
miss an
single
opportunity.
organization, you can just implement that. But if you're looking at things like, you know, larger scale where you have different representatives from, then it turns out most of the time it's all white men.
Well, yeah, so we're trying to, right, so we're trying to change that. So the Gender Champions of Nuclear Policy that Pam talked about is getting large organizations, well, small ones like Plowshares, larger ones like MacArthur, larger ones still like Los Alamos National Laboratories, who's joined, oh no, is it Livermore, I think, that's joined us. Los Alamos who's joined us, to commit to taking steps towards gender equity. So these are very large organizations. The IAEA is a member already of International, and we'd like to get them on ours to make commitments to, for example, make sure that there are no more all-male panels, right? That to make sure that they have goals, for example, to strive towards, as we do, a gender balance on our boards, or for us, it's gender balance in our grants. We've committed to half our grants go to women and women-led projects. So you put your money where your mouth is. Yeah. You start doing that, and you are starting to institutionalize the change. And that's basically my view. After years and years of organizing in various ways, you know, movements come and movements go. Interest in nuclear policy, you know, come and they go. So while it's coming, lock it in. Lock in the change. Make the structural change so that you can survive the dip in public interest. So that's what we're trying to do with both in the Gender Champions and in other initiatives we're undertaking. But so thank you for your suggestion.
So I have one suggestion in the spirit of, you know, whether this is an article, but especially if it's a book. I think actually you could pump up the realistic prospect that things are going to get a lot more dangerous in the presentation, and have, like, I think there are a lot of streams that are crossing all at the same time. So one of them is obviously things you've already indicated, a kind of nuclear resurgence. Nuclear stockpiles are growing again. Trillions of dollars are being invested in them, but also the strategic thinking around nuclear weapons is resurgent in a way that makes them thinkable because of the, you know, so you talk about all of that. But I think, yes. But there are a bunch of other things too. There are a whole bunch of emerging technological domains where the logics and norms associated with deterrence and use are way less understood than nuclear, that all touch on the possibility of nuclear war. So cyber, the development of artificial intelligence and machine learning, counter space capabilities, undersea capabilities, advanced conventional munitions like hypersonics, and all of this is happening at the same time.
Yes.
The most likely pathways to nuclear war are not that a president of China, Russia, or the United States wakes up and decides to do this. It is that they find themselves in a conflict where all of these domains are highly entangled and they fall into a nuclear apocalypse. So I think making that point, it would also appeal to the people who are like, yeah, nukes are the old thing, they're not the, and I think you can make the case intellectually, no, actually the new thing is the old thing.
Yes.
So that's thing two. Thing three is that the geopolitical environment is becoming more tense, and this leans into the Trump administration's own narrative about the world, as well as China and Russia's own, that an era of great power competition is back, and competitions for spheres of influence are back, and the possibility of having conflicts in the places where these spheres rub up against one another, and alliances and partnerships rub up against one another is higher than it's been since the Cold War. And then last is that the world is populated increasingly by leaders we shouldn't trust with nuclear weapons.
Yes.
No, and this is an argument about Trump, but it's just this. I mean, you can make the argument about Putin. You can make the. I mean, think about the leaders.
I think I've counted 7 of the 9 states are arguably have autocratic leaders with their finger on the button.
Right. So we are tied up in knots about the possibility of Kim Jong-un or the supreme leader of having nuclear weapons, and I think in both cases we should be worried about those possibilities. But like, there are a lot of other folks who already have nuclear weapons, and a lot of trends in our politics about how politics is made, how politics is expressed, strongman rule, populism, a whole bunch of things that are not actually conducive to the types of sober, rational deliberation that nuclear deterrence is rooted in. Anyway, there may be others, but the point being that I think you can pump it up.
Yes.
I think you can pump up the present danger so that the past feels present.
Excellent. So I thank you, and I do believe that. I didn't think you'd wanted me to talk for 2 hours.
I didn't want it now.
No. I understand. No, so you're exactly right, and I do believe this. The risk is growing for all the reasons you said. This is getting worse. It's not just that we'll be lucky to be able to survive the same situation for the next 50 years. It's not going to be the same situation. It's going to be a worse situation. Things are getting worse. These trends are intersecting. And for example, just cyber. NTI has an excellent study on the risks that cyber pose to command and control. That if we, not just that if we push the button, something might not happen, but if we don't push the button, something might happen. And how do you know that early warning that you're getting is real? This is a very real problem. It's not just an accident or a mechanical failure. Somebody could actively try to spook us into thinking we're being attacked when we're not. So yes, all those things are real. This thing I was trying to do, I was just exploring this idea, does this concept work? That the history of nuclear weapons over the 75 years is a tragic history. And the reason I do this is often when I go debate or I talk to people from the Strategic Command, their mantra is, nuclear weapons keep the peace. We have not had a great power conflict in 75 years because of nuclear weapons. And that's their line. And that has a certain appeal. And I think that is demonstrably untrue and it gives us a false sense of security. And I want to develop a sort of a counter narrative to the idea that we need nuclear weapons to keep us safe.
David, you want to jump in?
Yeah, and so I like to talk very much, but I did think there's a kind of issue of balance between talking about the environmental impact, the cost, all of this, because if the argument you're confronted with is, okay, it was very costly, but we've had 75 years of peace, that doesn't, and then people would say, well, we can clean up, we should do better,
right,
and so on. So
yes.
On some level, you have to address.
Right, all tragedies are not equal.
You have to address the argument you want to defeat directly.
Yes.
And now, maybe that's the wrong strategy. Maybe an indirect strategy is the best one. But my feeling is, at least you have to engage with that, and the others to think how then they support your argument, rather than just saying, well, look at it. The history is horrible. The aspects we've ignored, the consequences of nuclear testing, the fate of miners, the use of slave labor, all of that. I think there was an issue about how those things actually relate to one another.
Yes.
Rose had wanted to pile on.
Yes.
Yeah, just to follow up on that. I think, and this is from my experience at NATO, that it hasn't actually, put superpower conflict on hold or prevented great wars between the great powers. It has driven those wars underground. Nowadays at NATO, there is conflict every day going on, and it's so-called, cyber attacks, disinformation warfare, those kinds of non-kinetic, battle spaces, but they are nevertheless areas of conflict. So I think that's another way to look at it. And during the Cold War, we were driven into insurgencies, right, where we were fighting the Soviets in Angola and so forth and so on. We never came head to head, but it drove conflict into different spheres. So that's another way to think about it.
The stability and instability paradox that Joyce and others talk about.
Finger on David's point, I think you could confront the deterrence has worked more effectively than you do. And one way to do this is to take the NPR chart that was produced in in the Trump administration NPR that showed the number of deaths of the percentage of population dropping since 1945. And if you look and poke into that, you find out that they have no idea where they got that data. It was just been repeated over and over and over again.
Oh, yeah.
And if the population goes up, it is natural that the percentage of population dying in wars goes down. And it's exaggerated if you don't include civil wars, which they didn't do. So the mantra is represented repeatedly in the StratCom chart that is deeply, deeply flawed, and we get a C- if someone produces it in a class, but the government keeps reproducing.
Yes, yes,
It's really
yes,
shocking.
yes, yes. And there's also the, correlation equals causality. Right, all those things. So I believe nuclear weapons do play a deterrent role. Yes, but they're one of many things that have deterred great power conflict, including NATO, the IMF, the EU, all the other institutions that we created over these years that have prevented France and Germany from going to war, which they did every generation beforehand, even when they were just Franks and Goths. But they don't anymore. Why is that? Nuclear weapons? No, there's nothing to do with it. So there's much more to unravel there than that simplistic argument. And the only reason I'm raising this now is because it's the 75th year. And how are we going to talk about this? It's coming. Here it comes. This is, what month is this? Where are we? March? so I'm sorry, I've been in a board meeting for 3 days. I'm in my own.
I mean, it's Super Tuesday. I don't know what month it is. It's
Super Tuesday. The world is about to change. Yes. But it's coming. The stories will start to appear. You'll start seeing them, April, May, and then June, and then of course the Trinity test, and it's all going to come in for a brief moment. We're all going to be talking about nuclear weapons again on PBS and NPR and New York Times and New Yorker. And if I can get an article like this, the Atlantic will publish it. So is this the right theme? Is this the right way to go? Is this the right way to sort of, change the frame of how we've been looking at nuclear weapons as maybe our hero or a necessary evil? No, it's much worse than that. So that's what I'm going for. And I want to thank you very much. I can't think of a better place to start testing out this theory. A better group of people. I'm humbled to be here, and I hope we can stay in touch as I continue to work on this and continue to improve it. You've been more than an audience, a fabulous group of friends. Thank you very much for letting me come here.